The morning it happened, Solange Reyes had already been awake for 2 hours, sitting at the kitchen island with a mug of coffee going cold beside her laptop, reading through the third quarter supplier compliance file for the 4th time. The numbers on page 11 didn't sit right. A factory in the Ashford Industrial Group's Vietnamese textile division had passed its labor audit with a score that seemed, to her practiced eye, suspiciously clean. She had built the audit framework herself, 9 years earlier, back when Ashford was a mid-size manufacturer with 1,100 employees and a founder who still walked the floor. She knew what a clean score was supposed to look like. This one looked coached. She made a note in the margin, request raw audit data, not summary, and closed the laptop when she heard Julian's footsteps on the stairs. Her husband came down dressed the way he always dressed for a board week. Charcoal suit, no tie yet, the tie draped over his forearm like a matador's cape. He was 51 and looked, most mornings, like a man who had never once doubted the shape of his own life. This morning was different only in a way she couldn't name yet, a tightness around his mouth that she'd learned over 18 years of marriage to read as trouble, though she assumed, wrongly, that the trouble was his. "You're up early," he said, not quite a question. "Compliance numbers," she said. "The Haiphong facility, something's off with the audit." Julian's hand paused on the coffee carafe for half a second. So brief she would only recall it later, replaying the morning the way people replay accidents, hunting for the moment the road had actually turned. "It's a strong quarter," he said. "Let's not go looking for storms before the board meeting." "I'm not looking for storms. I'm looking at data. Solange." He said her name the way he said it in negotiations, when he wanted a room to feel the weight of patience being spent on their behalf. "We'll talk about it after the meeting." She let it go, because that was the rhythm of their marriage and their working relationship both. She flagged, he absorbed, and eventually, usually, he acted. It had worked for 18 years. It had worked well enough that when Ashford's founder, old Thomas Ashford, had handed the company to his son-in-law's protege rather than his own nephew, half the board had cited Julian and Solange together as the reason. A leadership team, not just a leader. Julian had the vision and the appetite for risk. Solange had built the values handbook that made the risk survivable, a leather-bound document, revised twice but never abandoned, that every senior executive signed upon promotion, right there on the cover page, in ink, like something out of an older and more serious era of American business. She had believed, until 9:47 that morning, that the handbook and the marriage were both permanent fixtures of her life. She was wrong about the timeline on one of them, by exactly 3 hours. Ashford Industrial Group occupied 11 floors of a glass tower in the Riverside Commercial District, with the executive suite on the top 2 floors arranged the way old money arranges things. Quietly, expensively, with more hallway than anyone strictly needed. Solange's office as Vice President of Governance and Corporate Culture sat 2 doors from Julian's, a proximity that had always struck outsiders as either romantic or absurd, depending on their appetite for corporate gossip. She arrived at 8:30, as she did every day, and was 3 sentences into an email to the audit committee chair, a steady, unshowy man named Kendrick Voss, when her assistant, Priscilla, appeared in the doorway with an expression Solange had never seen her wear before. "HR wants you in conference room C," Priscilla said. "Now, and there's someone from legal already in there." "Which HR issue?" Solange asked, already standing, already running through the list of personnel matters she was tracking, none of which required legal present at the outset. "I don't think it's an issue you're handling," Priscilla said quietly. "I think it's you." The walk from her office to conference room C was perhaps 40 seconds at a normal pace. Solange would later be able to describe, in exact and useless detail, every object she passed. The framed photograph of the Haiphong groundbreaking, the potted fig tree that always needed water, the intern by the printer who didn't look up. Her mind, in those 40 seconds, ran through the honest possibilities and discarded all of them, because none of the honest possibilities matched the sight that greeted her when she opened the door. Julian was not there. That was the first wrong note. In 18 years, decisions about her had never been made in a room he wasn't in. Instead, there was Marguerite Oyalaran from HR, whom Solange liked, sitting very still with a folder in front of her, and a legal associate named Fenwick, whom Solange did not particularly like, and on the table, two separate document sets, squared at the corners the way lawyers square things when they want a table to look like a courtroom. "Solange," Marguerite said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. "Please sit down." "I'll stand," Solange said, though something in her chest had already dropped 6 floors. "Tell me what this is." Marguerite slid the first folder across the table. "Effective this morning, your position as Vice President of Governance and Corporate Culture has been eliminated as part of an executive restructuring. This is not a performance action, it's structural." She said the word structural, the way people say words they've been told to say and don't believe. Solange did not open the folder. "Eliminated by whom?" "The decision came from the CEO's office," Fenwick said, in the flat tone of a man reading from a script he'd had no hand in writing and wanted no credit or blame for. "Approved this morning. Julian eliminated my position." Nobody answered that directly, which was its own answer. Fenwick slid the second folder across before Marguerite could say anything gentler. "This isn't a company matter," he said, with the faint discomfort of a man forced to do 2 jobs at once. "But given the timing, our office was asked to have it delivered concurrently rather than separately, for efficiency." Solange opened the second folder because some old professional reflex insisted she read documents before reacting to them, and found herself looking at a petition for dissolution of marriage, her name typed correctly in the caption, Julian's signature already notarized at the bottom, dated the previous evening. The previous evening, he had signed divorce papers the previous evening, slept beside her, made coffee with her at 6:15, discussed a labor audit with her, and said nothing. "He signed this last night," she said, mostly to herself. "I wasn't told the timeline," Marguerite said. "I'm sorry, Solange. I want you to know I fought to be the one in this room and not someone from outside. I didn't want you to hear it from a stranger." It was, Solange would think later, the single kindest sentence anyone said to her that day, and it did nothing at all to soften the floor falling away beneath her. She did not cry in conference room C. She had spent 18 years in rooms exactly like it, watching other people receive news exactly like this, and some old discipline in her simply refused to let her be the exception to her own professional habits, even now. She asked 3 questions: effective date, severance terms, and whether her badge access had already been revoked. It had, as of 9:02 that morning, 45 minutes before Priscilla came to get her, and then she stood, thanked Marguerite with a steadiness that cost her more than anyone in the room understood, and walked out into the hallway that 11 minutes earlier had held a life she recognized. She did not go to Julian's office. She went, instead, past the elevator bank, past the fig tree, to a narrow interior office with a hand-lettered sign that had never been updated to match the corporate directory. K. Voss, Audit and Governance. Kendrick Voss was 66, had joined Ashford's board 11 years earlier after selling his own manufacturing company to a larger competitor, and possessed the particular calm of a man who had already lost and rebuilt a fortune once, and found the second time around that very little rattled him. He looked up when she opened his door without knocking, and something in his face suggested he had been expecting her, or expecting someone, within the hour. "Solange," he said, "sit. You know, I know part of it. Sit down before you tell me the rest, because I suspect the rest is worse than what reached me." She sat and told him, the elimination of her role, the timing, the divorce papers delivered in the same folder as her severance, as if her marriage and her employment were line items on the same restructuring memo. Kendrick listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk, his expression unreadable, in a way she found, oddly, steadying rather than cold. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as a governance question, not a personal one, though I understand the two are tangled today in a way that isn't fair to you. Ask. Did you flag anything to Julian in the past week that he might have wanted to move faster than a normal review cycle allowed?" She thought of the Haiphong audit, the clean score that read coached, the Vietnamese textile compliance data. "I told him this morning I wanted the raw audit files, not the summary. He told me to wait until after the board meeting." Something crossed Kendrick's face. Not surprise, she noted, but a kind of grim confirmation, as though a suspicion he'd been carrying had just been handed its second data point. "Thank you for telling me that," he said. "I'd like you to write it down, today if you can, in an email to yourself with a timestamp exactly as you've told it to me. Not because I doubt you, because dates will matter. Kendrick, what do you know that I don't?" "Less than you'd think, and more than I'm free to say this morning," he said. "But I'll tell you this much, because you built the system that makes it true. Elimination of your position isn't a decision Julian was free to make alone, and he knows it, which tells me something about the state he's in. Go home. Take today. The board will not forget that you exist, Solange, whatever your husband may currently believe." It was the first sentence all day that sounded less like sympathy and more like a promise, and she carried it out of the building with her, past security, past the badge reader that no longer recognized her, into a parking garage where she sat behind the wheel of her car for 11 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. The house that evening was unbearably quiet, in the particular way houses become quiet when one person in them has decided, unilaterally, to end something the other person had believed was still being built. Julian did not come home until nearly 9. When he did, he found Solange in the kitchen, the same island, a fresh pot of coffee she had made and not touched, because some part of her still could not fully accept that the morning's ordinary rituals belonged to a life that no longer existed. "You could have told me," she said, before he'd set down his bag. "I know how this looks," he said. "It doesn't look like anything, Julian. It is something. You eliminated my job and served me divorce papers on the same morning, in the same building, delivered by people who work for you. The restructuring was Marcus's recommendation, not mine alone." "Don't," she said, and something in her voice made him stop. "Don't put your chief strategy officer's name on a decision you made about your own wife. I've watched you make hard calls for 18 years, Julian. I know what your decisions sound like when you actually believe in them. This doesn't sound like that. This sounds like you're protecting something, and you decided the fastest way to protect it was to remove me from every room where I might ask questions." He didn't answer that, which she understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, to be the truest answer he was capable of giving her. "The Haiphong audit," she said. "What's actually in the raw data, Julian? You don't work for the company anymore," he said quietly, and there was something almost like shame in how quietly he said it. "That isn't your concern now. It's still my name on the ethics framework that audit was supposed to be measured against," she said. "It will always be my concern. You didn't fire the vice president of governance this morning, Julian. You fired the person who knows exactly what your handbook requires of you. That's a very different thing to have done, and I don't think you've fully understood yet what it costs." She went upstairs alone that night, into a guest room, because the bedroom no longer felt like a room she was entitled to, and lay awake turning over the one detail that would not leave her: Kendrick Voss's calm. Not indifference. She knew him too well for that reading, but the specific, deliberate calm of a man who had seen a storm forming from a great distance and had already, quietly, begun making sure the house could withstand it. The board meeting was 6 days away. In the ordinary run of things, Solange would have spent those 6 days preparing binders, briefing materials, the quiet infrastructure work nobody applauded and everybody depended on. Instead, she spent the first 2 days simply absorbing the shape of what had happened to her, canceling a hair appointment she no longer had the heart for, calling her sister in Charlotte and getting through 4 sentences before her voice gave out, sitting in the guest room with the leather-bound values handbook she'd kept a personal copy of since the year she wrote it, running her thumb over the embossed cover the way some people touch a scar. On the 3rd day, she drove to the office anyway, not to enter. Her badge still didn't work, and she had no wish to make a scene at security, but to sit in the garage across the street with a coffee and watch the building the way you watch a house you used to live in. She was still there when Cecilia Marsh, the board's chair, walked out at 6:30, briefcase in one hand, phone in the other, and stopped dead at the sight of Solange's car idling by the curb. Cecilia was 71, silver-haired, precise in a way that had intimidated 3 decades of executives who mistook her gentleness for softness. She had chaired Ashford's board for 9 years and had, in that time, developed a reputation for saying almost nothing in meetings and remembering absolutely everything. She crossed the street without hesitation and got into the passenger seat as though she'd been invited, which, in a sense, she had been, by the simple fact that Solange didn't drive away. "I heard," Cecilia said, without preamble. "Everyone's heard, I imagine. Everyone's heard the version Julian's office released. That's a different thing from what happened, and I suspect you know that better than anyone alive." Cecilia folded her hands in her lap, an old habit from decades of board meetings, where her stillness had done more work than her words. "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, because the board meeting in 4 days is going to require one from someone, and it may as well be you first. Ask. 12 years ago, when this company had 400 employees and Thomas Ashford still called every board member himself before a vote, you wrote the escalation clause in the governance handbook. Section 7, the one that says any termination of a governance or compliance officer, at any level, automatically triggers a mandatory board review within 10 business days, regardless of the reason given, if that officer has an open finding under review at the time of termination. Solange had, in fact, forgotten the precise section number, though she had never forgotten writing the clause itself. Late one night, after watching a peer company implode in a labor scandal that its own compliance chief had flagged and been fired for flagging 3 weeks before the story broke. "I remember writing it," she said slowly. "I never imagined it would apply to me." "No one ever does," Cecilia said. "That's rather the point of writing it into the founding documents instead of trusting memory or goodwill. You have an open finding, don't you? The Haiphong audit. I flagged it the morning I was fired. I never got the raw data." Cecilia nodded, unsurprised, and for the first time Solange understood the source of the calm she'd sensed in Kendrick 2 days earlier. Not indifference to Julian's actions, but the settled confidence of people who had helped build a system precisely so that no single person's ambition, however talented, however beloved, could outrun the structure meant to catch it. "The board meeting in 4 days," Cecilia said, "was never going to be a routine quarterly session, Solange. The moment Marguerite processed your termination with an open finding attached, Section 7 activated automatically. Julian may not fully understand yet what he set in motion when he decided speed mattered more than process. I suspect in his current state of mind, he believes he simply removed an obstacle. What he actually did was trigger the one mechanism in this entire company that neither he nor anyone else has the authority to stop. Does he know? I imagine he's beginning to," Cecilia said, and there was no triumph at all in how she said it, only a kind of weary gravity, the look of someone watching a wound she had hoped never to see reopened. I want you to understand something before Thursday, because I don't think anyone has told you plainly enough yet. This board is not going to fight your battle for you, and it is not going to punish your husband because he hurt you personally. Whatever bond existed between the two of you, whatever it's become, is not this board's business, and I want no part in turning a governance review into a public settling of marital scores. But abuse of executive authority to suppress a compliance finding, that is very much this board's business, and it has been since the day you wrote the words that make it so. Thursday will not be about revenge, Solange. It will be about whether the company you helped build still means what it says it means. I think you already know which side of that question you're on. I would like to know whether you're prepared to stand in the room while we answer it. Solange looked out through the windshield at the glass tower across the street, lit floor by floor against the evening sky. 11 floors that had held nearly 2 decades of her working life, and, until 6 days ago, the architecture of a marriage she'd believed was built on the same foundation as the company. "I'm prepared," she said. "I've been prepared since the morning he told me not to look for storms." Cecilia allowed herself, for the first time, something almost like a smile. Brief, tired, entirely without malice. "Good," she said, "because I don't believe he understands yet that the storm was never something you went looking for. It was something you built the storm shelter for, 12 years before it arrived." Julian Ashford spent the 4 days before the board meeting the way he had spent every crisis of his career, by working harder, sleeping less, and mistaking motion for control. He met with Marcus Delgado, his chief strategy officer, twice a day. He called Fenwick in legal at hours that made the younger man's voice go thin with fatigue. He reviewed the Haiphong numbers himself, alone, in his office, with the door closed. The raw data this time, not the summary. And what he found there did not comfort him, though he told no one that. The audit had in fact been coached. Not falsified outright. The plant manager, a capable and frightened man named Dewey Pham, had not invented compliant conditions from nothing, but the third-party auditor had been given advance notice of the inspection window by 9 days instead of the contractually required 48 hours, enough time to temporarily reduce shift lengths, paper over 2 safety violations with hastily purchased equipment, and coach line workers on what to say if asked. Julian had not ordered this personally. He had, 3 weeks earlier, expressed frustration in a strategy call about the plant's numbers not being where they need to be before the board sees them. And Marcus Delgado, ambitious and eager to please a man who controlled his own next promotion, had translated that frustration into instructions the plant manager felt he could not refuse. Julian told himself, turning the raw data over at 11 at night in an empty office, that he had not asked for this. He told himself that for 2 full days, before he was honest enough to recognize the thinner truth beneath it, he had created, through 11 years of demanding results without asking closely enough how results were produced, exactly the kind of organization where a subordinate would hear frustration and manufacture comfort rather than deliver bad news. Solange had told him this, more than once, in more patient language, across more dinners than he could now clearly recall. He had listened the way a man listens to weather reports for a storm he doesn't believe will reach his particular house. And beneath even that recognition sat the harder truth, the one he had not yet permitted himself to examine directly, that he had fired his wife not because her role had genuinely become structurally redundant, but because some cornered, frightened part of him had understood, the moment she said the words raw audit files, that she would find exactly what he was now looking at, and that she would not let it wait quietly until after the board meeting the way he needed it to. He had not consciously decided to be a man who did that. He simply had, and now had 4 days to discover what kind of man that made him, in a company his own wife had spent a decade teaching him to believe should hold him accountable regardless of how much he had once been loved within it. The divorce papers sat, unaddressed, on the kitchen island for 3 of those 4 days, a silence neither of them broke. Solange had moved into the guest room permanently, in practice if not yet in paperwork, and the house had taken on the particular hush of two people orbiting each other's schedules with the precision of people determined not to collide. On the fourth evening, Julian found her in the kitchen again. She seemed always to be in the kitchen when their worst conversations happened, as though the room itself had become a courtroom neither of them had chosen, and he did something he had not done in the 6 days since Conference Room C. He sat down across from her, without a folder, without a legal strategy, and simply looked at her. "I read the raw data," he said. "I assumed you would, eventually. It's worse than the summary." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn, an old nervous habit she recognized from 20 years of watching him prepare to say something he didn't want to say. The auditor was tipped off. 9 days' notice instead of 2. Dewey Fam panicked and covered 2 safety violations that should have stopped production until fixed. "I know," Solange said. "I've known the shape of it since Tuesday morning. I didn't know the details until just now." "How do you know the shape of it if you don't work there anymore?" "Because I wrote the escalation clause that your termination of me automatically triggered, Julian. Section 7 of the handbook you signed the year we married. A board review is already underway." It was underway the moment Marguerite processed my exit with an open compliance finding attached to my file. Something in his face changed. Not shock exactly, she thought, but the particular collapse of a man realizing that a wall he'd assumed was load-bearing had in fact been load-bearing in a direction he hadn't accounted for. "You did this." "I didn't do anything, Julian. I wrote a clause 12 years ago because I watched a company implode after firing the one person trying to warn it, and I never wanted that to be possible here, for anyone, including, apparently, me. You triggered it yourself. The moment you decided the fastest way through a problem was to remove the person who could see it clearly. That isn't me exacting anything. That's the company doing precisely what you and I built it to do, back when we still wanted the same things for it." "And the divorce?" "The divorce," she said, and for the first time in days her voice wavered, just slightly, before steadying again, "is a separate matter, and I intend to keep it separate, because you tried very hard not to. You put my termination and my marriage in the same folder, delivered by the same office, on the same morning, as if ending both required the same signature and the same speed. I won't dignify that decision by treating them as the same conversation now. We can talk about our marriage, Julian, honestly, whenever you're ready to have that conversation, as two people, rather than as a CEO managing an inconvenient variable. But Thursday is not about us. Thursday is about whether Ashford Industrial still means what its own handbook says it means. I'd advise you, as someone who has watched you make good decisions for 18 years, to walk into that room and tell the truth before the truth walks in without your help. He did not answer that night. But she noticed, over the 2 days that followed, that he had stopped calling Marcus Delgado and had started, instead, calling Dewey Fam directly, not to manage him, but, as she later learned, to ask him, plainly, what had actually happened at the plant, and what it had cost him personally to make the numbers look the way Julian had wanted them to look. The board meeting convened on a Thursday morning in the room on the 11th floor that Ashford employees had for 2 generations, called simply the Long Table, a rectangular slab of dark walnut with 12 chairs, only 9 of which were occupied that day, since 3 board seats had gone unfilled since the last retirement wave. Cecilia Marsh called the meeting to order at 9, with a formality that struck several people in the room as unusual for a woman normally content to let agendas run themselves. Kendrick Voss sat to her immediate right, a folder in front of him that everyone in the room recognized, by its leather binding, as a copy of the company's values handbook, open to a marked page. Julian sat at the foot of the table, not the head, a positioning Solange noted the moment she was shown in by Marguerite, and seated in a chair reserved per the protocol she herself had written, for any officer whose termination had triggered a Section 7 review. "This meeting has one purpose," Cecilia said, once the room had settled. "The board is required under Section 7 of our governance charter to review the circumstances surrounding the termination of any compliance or governance officer with an open finding at the time of separation. Solange Reyes's position was eliminated 8 days ago. Her open finding concerns the third quarter labor compliance audit of our Haiphong facility. We are here to determine two things. First, whether that termination was connected to the suppression or delay of a legitimate compliance concern, and second, what this board's obligations are, under our own stated principles, in response to whatever we find." Marcus Delgado, seated 2 chairs from Julian, shifted in a way that suggested he already understood how badly this was going to go for him personally, and it did. Over the following 40 minutes, under careful, unhurried questioning from Kendrick Voss, it became clear that Marcus had relayed Julian's frustration about the Haiphong numbers to the plant manager in terms strong enough to be reasonably understood as an instruction to make the audit look better by whatever means were available, and that he had known, in general terms if not exact detail, that the auditor had been given improper advance notice. "Did the CEO instruct you to tip off the auditor?" Kendrick asked him directly. "No," Marcus said, and something in the flatness of his answer suggested he had rehearsed it, and equally, that it was strictly true. "He instructed me to make sure the numbers were where they needed to be before the board saw them. I made a judgment call about how to accomplish that." "And did you inform Mr. Ashford at any point before Solange Reyes's termination that your judgment call had involved improperly notifying a third-party auditor in advance of an inspection?" Marcus's silence lasted 4 seconds, which in that room, at that table, felt considerably longer. "No," he said finally, "I didn't." It was Julian, not Kendrick, who spoke next, and the room's attention swung to him with a suddenness that made Solange's chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected, some old marital instinct rising up beneath the governance officer's careful neutrality she'd been holding all morning. "I want to say something before this goes further," Julian said, "and I want to say it plainly, because I've spent 8 days discovering how much damage plain speaking 3 weeks ago would have prevented." He looked for a moment, not at the board, but at Solange, and then back at the table. "I put pressure on this organization to produce numbers that looked clean, rather than numbers that were clean. And I did it because I've spent this entire year believing that speed and results were the same thing as leadership. Marcus made a bad call, but he made it in an environment I built, where a bad call felt safer to him than an honest one. That's on me before it's on him. And the termination of Miss Reyes," Cecilia said, her voice even, giving him no ground and no ambush either. On the same morning, she raised the concern about that audit's raw data. "Was that connected?" Julian was quiet for a long moment. Solange watched him weigh, visibly, the version of the answer that would protect him and the version that was true, and understood, with something that felt unexpectedly like grief, rather than vindication, that she was watching her husband decide, in real time, in front of 9 people who had once trusted him completely, what kind of man he still wanted to be able to look at in a mirror. "Yes," he said finally, "it was connected. I told myself the restructuring was strategic. It wasn't. I was afraid of what she'd find if she kept looking, and I used authority I hold as CEO to remove the person most likely to find it, before this board could see it the way I was seeing it. I own that fully. I don't have a version of this that makes it smaller than it was." The room did not applaud this. Nobody's face broke into relief or vindication. Cecilia simply nodded, once, the way a person nods at a fact finally placed correctly on the record, and made a note in the margin of her own copy of the agenda. "Thank you for the candor," she said. "It doesn't undo the 8 days Ms. Reyes has spent without a position she held with distinction for a decade. And it doesn't undo the risk your subordinates' decisions created for 240 workers at that facility. But it will matter considerably to what this board decides today, and I want that understood by everyone at this table before we move to the harder part of this conversation. She turned then and looked down the table, past Marcus, past Julian, to where Solange sat in the chair, reserved for the officer at the center of the review. Miss Reyes, Cecilia said, the board has questions for you as well, and I want to ask the first one myself, because I believe you're the only person in this room who can answer it honestly. You wrote Section 7 12 years ago. You could not, at the time, have known it would one day be applied to your own termination by your own husband, now that it has been. Do you believe the system you built has functioned the way you intended it to? Solange looked around the long table, at Kendrick's steady patience, at Cecilia's careful neutrality, at Julian's face, drawn and honest in a way she had not seen it in months, at Marcus, pale and cornered by his own judgment, at the empty chairs that represented the board seats the company had never quite gotten around to filling. She thought of the morning 6 days earlier, when she had sat in conference room C and understood, in the space of 40 seconds, that a marriage and a career could end on the same folder, delivered by the same hands, and she thought of every quiet hour she had spent, over a decade, writing clauses she'd hoped the company would never need. I think it's functioning exactly as intended, she said, which is the strange, uncomfortable thing about building a good system, Cecilia. You don't get to watch it work from a safe distance. Eventually, it comes for the people who built it too, if they've made mistakes, or been wronged, or both, and it doesn't ask permission first. I built Section 7 because I believed no single person's ambition or affection or fear should be able to outrun the company's obligation to its own workers and its own stated values. I didn't imagine, 12 years ago, testing that belief from this particular chair, but I still believe it. I wouldn't want it to work any differently, even now, even for me. Kendrick Voss, silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke, closing the leather-bound handbook in front of him with a soft, deliberate sound that seemed to settle over the room like a held breath finally released. Then I move, he said, that we proceed to the substance of what this board is obligated to decide. Before Cecilia could call the vote to enter closed session, one of the newer board members, a former plant operations executive named Abina Osei, who had joined Ashford's board only 14 months earlier and had said almost nothing through the entire morning, raised a hand. I'd like the record to reflect one more thing before we move behind closed doors, Abena said. I've sat on 3 boards in my career, and I've watched 2 of them handle a moment like this one badly, quickly, quietly, with a settlement and a non-disparagement clause and a company statement about a valued executive pursuing new opportunities. I want it on the record that I understand what we are choosing not to do today, and I want to understand why before we vote on what we are choosing to do instead. Cecilia nodded, unoffended, as though she had been waiting for exactly this question from exactly this kind of newer, sharper voice. Because a quiet settlement protects 2 people's reputations, she said, and this board's obligation, per its own charter, is to protect 240 workers in Haiphong and the shareholders who trust that our stated values are load-bearing. Those obligations don't always point in a comfortable direction, Abina, and today they don't. We are choosing the slower, less flattering path because it's the only one consistent with the document every person at this table signed on the day they joined it. Abena considered that, then nodded once, satisfied in the particular way of someone testing a structure's honesty rather than its comfort. Then I'm ready to vote, she said. The closed session that followed ran nearly 4 hours, longer than any board meeting in the company's recent history, and Solange spent most of it in the small waiting room outside, not because she was excluded by rule, but because Cecilia had gently suggested that the board's deliberation on remedies would be more honest without the person most personally affected watching every face in the room. Solange had agreed, understanding the wisdom in it, even as the waiting cost her something. She sat with Priscilla, who had come up unbidden from 2 floors below, with 2 coffees and no questions, and the 2 of them said very little, which was its own kind of company. When the doors finally opened, it was Kendrick who came to get her, rather than sending Marguerite, and something in the set of his shoulders told her, before he said a word, that the room had landed somewhere serious, rather than somewhere theatrical. "It's not finished," he told her quietly, in the corridor, before walking her back in. "But it's real. I think you'll recognize the shape of it. It's the shape you drew for us 12 years ago, whether you remember every line of it or not." The board did not resolve everything in that room, that day, and Solange had known enough about governance, long before she'd needed to live inside one of her own clauses, to understand that responsible institutions rarely move as fast as wounded people want them to. What the board did over the following 3 weeks was slower, less cinematic, and, she would come to feel, once the immediate ache had dulled enough to let her feel anything clearly, considerably more durable than the version of justice she might once have imagined wanting. The first decision, reached that same afternoon after a closed session that ran nearly 4 hours, was procedural but not small. Solange's termination was formally reversed as a governance matter, not reinstated as an act of personal favor, but voided on the finding that it had been executed in violation of the company's own conflict of interest provisions. Specifically, that Julian, as her spouse and as the executive whose conduct was under her department's review, should never have had unilateral authority to eliminate her position in the first place, and that the restructuring documentation Marcus had prepared to justify it had been backdated to obscure that fact. It was, Cecilia noted dryly for the record, precisely the kind of failure Section 7 existed to catch, and precisely why it had been written to require board review rather than trusting any single executive's judgment, however well-intentioned, in matters touching his own household. The second decision took longer and cost Julian more. The board did not remove him as CEO outright. Several members, including Kendrick, argued forcefully that a company built on the principle of accountability through process, rather than punishment through spectacle, owed even a leader who had failed badly the chance to be judged by that same process, rather than by the swiftest available humiliation. Instead, the board placed Julian under a formal governance remediation plan, a 2-year period of enhanced board oversight on all personnel and compliance-adjacent decisions, mandatory recusal from any matter touching his own family or direct reports misconduct, and a public accounting to shareholders. Not a press conference staged for redemption, but a plain, unglamorous line in the next quarterly filing acknowledging the labor violations at Haiphong, the remediation underway at the facility, and the executive failures that had allowed it to nearly go unaddressed. Marcus Delgado did not survive the review. He resigned 3 days later, before the board could formally act, in a letter that Solange read once, and did not keep, notable mostly for how carefully it avoided the word sorry in favor of the word unfortunate, as though what had happened to 240 workers in Haiphong and to Solange's career alike had been weather rather than choice. The news moved through the 11 floors of Ashford's headquarters the way news of that kind always moves. Not through any official channel, but through the particular capillary system of assistants and interns and the woman who ran the mailroom, who somehow always knew things a full day before the executive floor did. By the following Monday, most of the building understood, in broad if imprecise strokes, that something serious had happened at the top of the company, and that it had ended, at least in part, with the CEO admitting fault in a room full of people who had once simply trusted him. Solange, walking through the lobby that week for the first time since her badge had been reactivated, found herself stopped twice by employees she barely knew by name: a facilities coordinator, a junior analyst from the finance team, each of them saying some version of the same halting, sincere thing, that they were glad someone had asked the hard question, that they hadn't been sure anyone still would. It struck her, more than the board's formal remedies, more even than Julian's admission at the long table, as the truest measure of what had actually been repaired. Not headlines, not a press release, a facilities coordinator who felt, for the first time in longer than she could say, that the company's stated values weren't simply a poster in the break room. Do fam. The plant manager who had panicked and papered over 2 safety violations under pressure he had never had the standing to refuse, kept his job, at Solange's own recommendation once she returned in an advisory capacity. Not out of sentiment, she told the board plainly, but because the review had made clear he was a man caught inside a bad system rather than the architect of one, and firing him would only teach the next plant manager the same fearful lesson that had produced the crisis in the first place. He wept when he was told, in a call Solange took personally, and thanked her for something she quietly understood was less about the job itself than about being seen, for the first time in the crisis, as a person rather than a liability. "I want to ask you something, if I can," Dewey said near the end of that call, his English careful and formal, in the way of a man who had learned it for business rather than conversation. "Why did you fight for me when I am the one who signed the false paperwork?" "Because you signed it afraid, not greedy," Solange said. "There's a difference, and a good system has to know how to tell them apart, or it ends up punishing the wrong people while the actual failure walks free with a severance package. I built this company's governance framework to catch executives who abuse authority. I never wanted it to also crush the workers those executives frighten into silence. If it did that, it would have failed at the only job that ever mattered." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I will make sure the next audit needs no coaching," he said. "Not because I am told to, because I want it to be true when someone looks at it." "That's the only reason it should ever be true," she said, and meant it more than she had meant almost anything she'd said in the 8 weeks since Conference Room C. The shareholder letter, when it finally went out at the close of the quarter, was 3 paragraphs long and contained none of the language Ashford's communications team had originally drafted. No talk of renewed commitment to excellence, no soft phrase like isolated incident, which Cecilia had struck from the draft herself, with a single line through the middle of the page. What went out instead was plainer and, Solange thought, considerably harder to write. An acknowledgement that a labor compliance audit at the Haiphong facility had been improperly influenced, that senior leadership decisions had contributed to the conditions that made that possible, that the company's own governance mechanisms had identified and corrected the failure without requiring outside intervention, and that a remediation plan, publicly summarized in an attached filing, was already underway. Wall Street's reaction was muted rather than dramatic. The stock dipped 2 points the day the letter went out and recovered within the week, a fact that several financial commentators noted, with a kind of grudging respect, as evidence that markets increasingly rewarded companies that could demonstrate working internal accountability more than they punished companies willing to admit imperfection honestly and early. One analyst, in a note that made its way to Cecilia's desk and from there, eventually, to Solange's, wrote that Ashford's handling of the matter reads less like a crisis and more like a stress test the company appears to have designed for itself a decade in advance. A sentence Cecilia read aloud to Solange over coffee, with something that might, in a woman less careful with her expressions, have been called delight. Solange did not return to her old title. The board, in its final session on the matter, offered her something different. A newly created role, senior advisor to the board on governance and institutional integrity, reporting not to the CEO, but directly to Cecilia and the board itself, with a mandate to review and strengthen exactly the kinds of structural blind spots that had allowed a single executive sphere to to nearly outrun a decade of careful design. It was, everyone in the room understood without needing to say it aloud, both a promotion and a quiet acknowledgement that the old arrangement, governance officer married to the CEO, however well it had functioned for 18 years, had contained a vulnerability that no amount of good faith could fully close. Dufam, the plant manager who had panicked and papered over 2 safety violations under pressure he had never had the standing to refuse, kept his job, at Solange's own recommendation, once she returned in an advisory capacity, not out of sentiment, she told the board plainly, but because the review had made clear he was a man caught inside a bad system rather than the architect of one, and firing him would only teach the next plant manager the same fearful lesson that had produced the crisis in the first place. He wept when he was told, in a call Solange took personally, and thanked her for something she quietly understood was less about the job itself than about being seen, for the first time in the crisis, as a person rather than a liability. Solange did not return to her old title. The board, in its final session on the matter, offered her something different. A newly created role, Senior Advisor to the Board on Governance and Institutional Integrity, reporting not to the CEO, but directly to Cecilia and the board itself, with a mandate to review and strengthen exactly the kinds of structural blind spots that had allowed a single executive's fear to nearly outrun a decade of careful design. It was, everyone in the room understood without needing to say it aloud, both a promotion and a quiet acknowledgement that the old arrangement, governance officer married to the CEO, however well it had functioned for 18 years, had contained a vulnerability that no amount of good faith could fully close. "I want to ask you something before you accept," Cecilia said, the two of them alone in her office afterward, late enough that the building had gone mostly dark around them. "Not as board chair, as someone who's watched you build things here longer than almost anyone. Do you want this because it's right, or because some part of you still wants to be close enough to Julian's decisions to protect the company from him?" It was a fair question, and Solange gave it the honesty it deserved. "Both, if I'm truthful," she said, "but mostly the first. I built Section 7 because I believed integrity has to be structural, not personal, that it can't depend on any one person's goodwill, mine included, still being intact on the day it's tested. I'd like to keep building that. Whether Julian is CEO in 2 years or not isn't really the reason anymore. I'm not sure it ever should have been the only reason." She and Julian did not reconcile, not in the way the earliest, angriest days had made her briefly wonder whether some part of her wanted. The divorce proceeded, uncontested on the financial terms, slower and quieter than either of them had expected, once the manufactured urgency of that first terrible morning fell away. But something else emerged in its place over those weeks. Not a marriage, but a functioning, adult regard between two people who had once built something significant together and were now, however painfully, choosing to hold each other accountable to the best parts of what they'd built, rather than burn it down out of grief for what they'd lost. "I keep thinking about the handbook," Julian said, the last time they spoke as still married people, in the kitchen that had held so much of the worst of it, the leather-bound copy sitting between them on the island, where the divorce papers had once sat. "I signed it the year we married. I don't think I understood, at the time, that I was signing something that would eventually hold me to account more honestly than I was prepared to hold myself. That was rather the point," Solange said, without unkindness. "None of us fully understand what we're promising the day we promise it. The measure isn't whether you understand it perfectly at the start, Julian. It's whether you're willing to be held to it anyway, especially on the days you'd rather not be." He nodded, and did not argue, and for the first time in 8 weeks, she felt something loosen in her chest that she recognized, cautiously, as the early shape of peace rather than grief. They did not become friends, exactly, in the months that followed, The word felt too small for what remained between two people who had built a life and a company together and then watched a portion of both come apart in the same 8-day span. But they developed something adjacent to friendship, a working peace built out of specific, deliberate choices, separate legal counsel who nonetheless spoke to each other civilly, a single difficult dinner, 3 months after the papers were finalized, where they talked mostly about the Haiphong remediation timeline, and, only at the very end, briefly and without rancor, about what each of them might have done differently in the years before any of it became a crisis. A mutual, unspoken agreement never to make either of their children, grown now, both away at graduate programs on opposite coasts, carry the weight of choosing a side. Julian remained CEO under the board's remediation plan, though the man who emerged from those 2 years was, by his own admission, and by the quiet observation of people who had worked beside him for a decade, changed in ways that went beyond the procedural. He began holding what he called, without much self-consciousness, uncomfortable Fridays, a standing hour on the calendar where any employee, regardless of level, could raise a concern about a decision he'd made, with no retaliation clause required, because he'd made the meeting mandatory for himself rather than optional for them. Solange heard about it secondhand, from Priscilla, months after she'd stopped hearing much about Julian's daily life at all, and found that the news landed in her chest, not as vindication, but as something quieter and, in its own way, harder to sit with. Relief that the marriage's ending had, apparently, cost him enough to actually teach him something. The Haiphong facility passed its next audit 6 months later, not cleanly, not without the discomfort of real findings honestly recorded, but truthfully, with an auditor given the full 48-hour window the contract required and nothing more, and with Dewey Pham, promoted now to regional oversight, personally walking the new corporate audit team through every line item without flinching. Solange read the report at her desk in the advisory office on the 10th floor, one flight below where her old office had been, and felt none of the vindication she might once have expected, and all of the quieter, sturdier satisfaction of watching a system do precisely the unglamorous work it had been built to do. Cecilia Marsh, at the shareholder meeting that spring, closed her remarks on the matter with a line that would later be quoted, without much fanfare, in a handful of trade publications covering the quarter. That a company's values were not measured by the framed document in its lobby, but by whether that document still had teeth on the one morning its most powerful person needed it not to. Ashford Industrial Group had, she said, been tested that year in a way no board ever hopes to be tested, and had held, not because any one person had been heroic, but because, years earlier, someone patient and unglamorous enough to think in decades rather than quarters had built the structure that made heroism unnecessary. Solange was in the third row when she said it, and did not need the recognition, because she had long since stopped needing the story to be about her at all. What she needed and what she found, in the months that followed, was simpler and had been the point all along. A company that still meant what it said, workers in a factory 6,000 miles away who went home safely at the end of their shifts, and a Tuesday morning, some weeks later, when she opened her laptop, found the numbers clean, without needing to ask twice, and closed it again without a single note in the margin. It was, she thought, exactly what a system built well enough was supposed to feel like from the inside. Quiet, unremarkable, and entirely trustworthy. Which was, in the end, the only kind of vindication that had ever actually mattered to her.